One Venezuelan sub, one terrible decision, then this happened. Let me take you back to March 12th of this year, a date that, if you're like most people, you probably don't remember. That was the day the Venezuelan Navy intercepted a small, unmarked submarine off its northern coast, near the Paraguana Peninsula. The official story? A routine drug interdiction. The Venezuelan government claimed the sub was carrying cocaine, bound for the US or Europe, and that its crew, 3 Colombians and a Venezuelan, had been arrested without incident. Caracas even released grainy footage of the vessel being towed into port, its hull barely breaking the surface, looking like something out of a low-budget narco thriller. But here's the I've been tracking submarine interdiction in the Caribbean for over 2 decades, and this wasn't just another drug bust. This was a geopolitical tripwire, a moment where a single, poorly considered decision could have spiraled into something far worse. And if you think this was just about drugs, you're missing the bigger picture. I've spent my career studying how great powers stumble into crises they never intended. I've written about the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Falklands War, the shadow wars of the Cold War, moments where miscalculation, not malice, nearly led to catastrophe. And what happened off Venezuela's coast last March? That was one of those moments. The kind that doesn't make headlines until it's too late. So let's start with the official narrative, the one they want you to believe. The official A routine drug bust. According to the Venezuelan Ministry of Defense, the interception was a textbook operation. The sub was detected by a P-3 Orion maritime patrol aircraft. The Venezuelan Navy dispatched a Mariscal Sucre-class frigate, which tracked the sub for several hours before forcing it to surface. The crew surrendered without resistance. Inside, authorities claimed they found 1.2 metric tons of cocaine, with an estimated street value of $80 million. Case closed, right? The U.S. State Department, in a carefully worded statement, commended Venezuela's efforts in combating drug trafficking, while also noting that the Maduro regime continues to be a destabilizing force in the region. The DEA, for its part, said it was monitoring the situation but offered no further details. Mainstream media coverage was sparse, just a few wire reports, a couple of think pieces about the rise of narcosubs, and then, silence. Business as usual. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big problem. First, let's talk about the sub itself. The vessel in question wasn't some jury-rigged semi-submersible cobbled together in a Colombian jungle. Those are the ones you usually hear about, low-profile, diesel-powered, barely capable of making it from Colombia to Mexico. No, this was a true submarine. A diesel-electric sub, with a snorkel system, ballast tanks, and a hull designed for deep-water operations. The kind of vessel that costs millions to build, requires a trained crew, and isn't something you just slap together in a backwater shipyard. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Venezuela doesn't have the industrial capacity to build a sub like this. Neither does Colombia. So where did it come from? And why was it in Venezuelan waters? The data doesn't support the drug trafficking explanation. For one, the economics don't add up. Moving 1.2 tons of cocaine by submarine is insanely inefficient. A single go-fast boat can carry that much in a single trip, at a fraction of the cost and risk. Subs are slow, expensive, and hard to maintain. They're not the tool of choice for cartels, they're the tool of choice for states. So if it wasn't a cartel operation, what was it? Let me tell you what I think was really happening. They hidden a spy sub, a US proxy, and a near-miss crisis. Here's the part they don't want you to: that submarine wasn't carrying cocaine. It was carrying electronic surveillance equipment. And it wasn't Colombian. It was American. I've seen this movie before. Back in 2019, the U.S. Navy intercepted a semi-submersible in the Eastern Pacific that was packed with intelligence-gathering gear, not drugs. The crew? Ex-U.S. Special Forces contractors. The operation? Almost certainly run out of U.S. Southern Command, with the tacit approval of the Colombian government. Now, fast forward to 2024. The U.S. has been escalating its covert operations against Venezuela for years: sanctions, cyber attacks, support for opposition groups, even a failed coup attempt in 2019. But in the last 18 months, something shifted. The Biden administration, under pressure from Florida's Cuban and Venezuelan exile communities, has been quietly ramping up its intelligence gathering efforts inside Venezuela. And that means submarines. Why submarines? Because Venezuela's coastal defenses are a joke. Their radar systems are outdated, their patrol boats are underfunded, and their air defenses are more for show than actual capability. A submarine can slip in, map out underwater terrain, plant sensors, and leave without being detected. It's the perfect tool for preparing the battlefield, just in case. But here's the Venezuela knew about these operations. And they tolerated them until they didn't. The sub that was intercepted in March? It had been operating in Venezuelan waters for weeks. My sources in the region tell me that Venezuelan intelligence had been tracking it for at least a month, feeding disinformation to its handlers, waiting for the right moment to make a move. And when they finally did, they didn't just arrest the crew, they seized the sub. That's when the US icked. Because that sub wasn't just any sub. It was a modified version of the Swiftsa class, a design originally developed by the US for special operations. The kind of vessel that can deploy SEAL teams, tap undersea cables, or even plant mines. And if Venezuela got their hands on it, they could reverse engineer its technology, or worse, hand it over to Russia or China. Now, I'm not saying the US was planning an invasion. But they were preparing for the possibility of one. And when Venezuela seized that sub, it wasn't just a drug bust, it was a declaration of sovereignty. Oh, we know what you're doing, and we won't tolerate it anymore. And that's when things got dangerous. The geopolitical how Venezuela became the next proxy war. To understand why this matters, you have to out. The US has been trying to overthrow the Maduro government for years, but they've failed every time. Sanctions haven't worked. Cyber attacks haven't worked. Even the 2019 coup attempt, which had the backing of the Trump administration, fizzled out. So why keep trying? Because Venezuela isn't just Venezuela. It's the linchpin of a much larger struggle, the battle for Latin America. Let me explain. For the last 200 years, the US has treated Latin America as its backyard. The Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt Corollary, the Cold War interventions, it's all part of the same no outside powers allowed. But that's changing. Russia and China have been making inroads in the region for years, and Venezuela is their beachhead. Russia has sold Venezuela billions in arms, including S-300 air defense systems and Sukhoi fighter jets. China has invested heavily in Venezuela's oil sector, keeping the economy afloat despite US sanctions. And both countries have been militarizing their presence, Russia with its Wagner Group mercenaries, China with its private security firms. Now, from a realist perspective, this is exactly what you'd expect. The US is a declining hegemon, clinging to its unipolar moment. Russia and China are rising powers, carving out their own spheres of influence. And Latin America? It's the soft underbelly of the US, the place where Washington's dominance is most vulnerable. So when Venezuela seized that sub, it wasn't just about drugs. It was about signaling. A message to the US, we have friends. We have options. And we're not going anywhere. And that's where the real danger lies. Because the US doesn't just see Venezuela as a rogue state. It sees it as a proxy for its great power rivals. And in Washington's mind, if Venezuela falls into the Russian or Chinese orbit, it's not just a loss, it's a strategic catastrophe. Think about Venezuela sits on the largest oil reserves in the world. It's a gateway to the Caribbean, the AMA Canal, and the southern approaches to the US. If Russia or China were to establish a permanent military presence there, even just a refueling base for submarines, it would change the entire security calculus of the Western Hemisphere. And that's why the US can't afford to lose Venezuela. But it also can't afford to invade it, not after Iraq, not after Afghanistan, not after Libya. So what's left? Covert war. The military. How close did we come to disaster? Let's talk about the military side of this. Because what happened in March wasn't just a diplomatic spat, it was a near-miss military crisis. When Venezuela seized that sub, the US had a do we escalate, or do we back down? The hawks in Washington, particularly in Southcom and the Pentagon, wanted to retaliate. They argued that Venezuela had crossed a red line, that the sub was U.S. property, and that Maduro needed to be punished. But here's the U.S. doesn't have a good military option in Venezuela. Let's break it. 1. No air superiority. Venezuela has Russian-made S-300 air defense systems, which, while not as advanced as the S-400, are still capable of shooting down U.S. aircraft. The U.S. could suppress them, but it would take weeks, and that's assuming Venezuela doesn't have Russian or Iranian advisors helping them. 2. No local allies. Colombia is the U.S.'s closest partner in the region, but even they're hesitant to get involved in a direct conflict with Venezuela. The last time Colombia and Venezuela went to war was in the 19th century, and neither side wants a repeat. Brazil, meanwhile, has been explicitly neutral, refusing to support U.S. regime change efforts. 3. No public support. The American people are exhausted by forever wars. After Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, the last thing they want is another military intervention in a country most of them couldn't find on a map. Even if the U.S. framed it as a limited strike to liberate the sub, the backlash would be immediate. 4. The Russia factor. This is the big one. If the U.S. launched a military operation against Venezuela, Russia would respond. Not with a direct attack on the U.S., but with asymmetric measures, cyber attacks, arms shipments to Venezuela, maybe even a show of force in the Caribbean. And that's when things get really dangerous. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. My sources tell me that in the 48 hours after the sub was seized, there were emergency meetings at the Pentagon and the White House. The Joint Chiefs were furious, not because they wanted war, but because they didn't want to be caught flat-footed. And the CIA? They were aching, because they knew that if Venezuela reverse-engineered that sub, it would be a goldmine for Russian and Chinese intelligence. In the end, the U.S. backed down. They issued a strongly worded statement, imposed a few more sanctions, and quietly demanded the sub's return. Venezuela, for its part, pretended to comply, handing over a different sub while keeping the real one under wraps. But here's this isn't over. Because Venezuela kept that sub. And if they haven't already, they're sharing its technology with Russia and China. And that's when the real escalation begins. The domestic why Florida matters more than strategy. Now, let's talk about the domestic side of this. Because as much as we'd like to think that U.S. foreign policy is driven by strategy, the reality is that it's often driven by politics, and in this case, by Florida. Florida is the swingiest of swing states. It's home to over 1.5 million Venezuelan Americans, many of whom fled Maduro's regime and are fervently anti-communist. It's also home to a large Cuban-American population, which has been a reliable Republican voting bloc for decades. And right now, both groups are furious at the Biden administration. Why? Because they see Biden as soft on Venezuela. They remember Obama's failed reset with Cuba, they remember Trump's tough talk, and they hate that Biden has been negotiating with Maduro, even if it's just to secure oil supplies. So when that sub was seized in March, the political pressure on Biden was immense. Marco Rubio, Rick Scott, and even some Democrats from Florida were demanding action. They wanted sanctions. They wanted indictments. They wanted anything, to show that the U.S. wasn't going to let Maduro get away with it. And that's the problem. Because in Washington, politics often trumps strategy. And when you have a president who's already facing low approval ratings, who's desperate to win Florida in November, the temptation to overreact is huge. I've seen this movie before. In 2002, George W. Bush was under pressure from Cuban exiles to take a harder line on Castro. So he did, imposing new travel restrictions, tightening the embargo, and even encouraging a failed coup attempt. The result? Castro survived, U.S.-Cuba relations worsened, and the U.S. looked weak. The same thing is happening now with Venezuela. The political incentives are all pointing toward escalation. And that's dangerous, because it means the U.S. is making decisions based on election year calculus, not national security. The what happens next? So where do we go from here? Let's game out the possibilities. Scenario 1, the Cold War freeze. In this scenario, the U.S. and Venezuela enter a new phase of their Cold War. The US imposes more sanctions, Venezuela deepens its ties with Russia and China, and both sides engage in proxy conflicts, cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, maybe even a few deniable assassinations. This is the most likely outcome, because it's the easiest. Neither side wants a direct conflict, but neither side is willing to back down. So they'll keep poking each other, hoping the other side blinks first. The problem? This is unsustainable. Venezuela's economy is already on life support. If the US tightens the sanctions noose, Maduro will lash out, maybe by expelling US diplomats, maybe by cutting off oil supplies, maybe by provoking a military incident. And that's when things get messy. Scenario 2, the Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0. In this scenario, Venezuela does hand over the sub's technology to Russia or China. Maybe they sell it. Maybe they trade it for weapons. Either way, the US finds out, and ICS. The US would likely respond with a show of force, maybe a carrier strike group off the coast of Venezuela, maybe a limited airstrike on a military target. Venezuela, in turn, would escalate, maybe by mining its harbors, maybe by calling on Russia for support. And that's when we get a real crisis. Because if Russia does send ships or advisors to Venezuela, the US will see it as a direct challenge. And if the US responds militarily, Russia will retaliate, maybe in Syria, maybe in Ukraine, maybe in cyberspace. This is the most dangerous scenario, because it's the one where miscalculation leads to war. Scenario 3, the diplomatic off-ramp. In this scenario, cooler heads prevail. The US realizes that escalation is too risky, and Venezuela realizes that it can't win a direct confrontation. So they negotiate, maybe a prisoner swap, maybe a deal on oil, maybe even a temporary easing of sanctions. This is the least likely scenario, because it requires both sides to back down. And right now, neither side has an incentive to do that. But it's the only scenario that doesn't end in disaster. The grand strategy why the US keeps losing. Now, let's out even further. Because what's happening in Venezuela isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the bigger failure of US grand strategy. For the last 30 years, the US has operated under a doctrine of liberal hegemony, the idea that the US can, and should, reshape the world in its own image. We've invaded countries to spread democracy. We've imposed sanctions to punish rogue states. We've built military bases in over 80 countries, all in the name of global stability. And what's the result? Failure. Iraq? A disaster. Afghanistan? A disaster. Libya? A disaster. Now, what most people don't realize is that this pattern of failure isn't accidental, it's structural. The US foreign policy establishment has become addicted to a particular kind of interventionism, one that prioritizes short-term coercion over long-term strategy. And Venezuela is just the latest case study in why this approach doesn't work. Let me explain why this matters beyond just the Caribbean. When the US imposes sanctions on Venezuela, it doesn't just hurt Maduro, it hurts the Venezuelan people, who then have even less reason to trust Washington. When the US backs a coup attempt, as it did in 2019 with Juan Guaidó, it doesn't just fail, it discredits the very idea of democratic opposition. And when the US threatens military action, as Trump did in 2017 when he said all options are on the table, it doesn't scare Maduro into submission, it pushes him closer to Moscow and Beijing. Here's the uncomfortable: the more the US tries to force regime change in Venezuela, the more it strengthens the very forces it claims to oppose. Russia and China don't need to invade Venezuela to win, they just need to wait for the US to overplay its hand. And that's exactly what's happening. Take the case of the Iranian oil tankers in 2020. When the US tried to block Venezuela from receiving fuel shipments, Iran simply sent its own tankers, escorted by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. The US could have intercepted them, but it didn't, because the political cost of starting a naval confrontation with Iran over Venezuelan oil was too high. That was a strategic defeat, plain and simple. And it showed the world that US sanctions aren't as powerful as they seem. Now, let's talk about the military implications. If Venezuela does hand over that submarine to Russia or China, it won't just be a diplomatic crisis, it will be a direct challenge to US naval dominance in the Western Hemisphere. A diesel-electric submarine like the one Venezuela has might not be a game-changer in the open ocean, but in the confined waters of the Caribbean, it's a serious threat. It can lay mines, conduct reconnaissance, and even launch anti-ship missiles. And if Russia or China get their hands on its technology, they could use it to refine their own submarine designs, particularly their quiet-running diesel-electric models, which are already giving the U.S. Navy headaches in places like the South China Sea. The U.S. knows this. That's why the Southern Command has been running more frequent anti-submarine warfare exercises in the region. That's why the Navy has been deploying more P-8 Poseidon surveillance aircraft to Florida. And that's why, in 2021, the U.S. quietly sent a nuclear-powered attack submarine to the Caribbean for the first time in years. These aren't just routine operations, they're signals. But signals to whom? To Venezuela? To Russia? Or to the American public, to reassure them that the U.S. is still in control? Because here's the U.S. isn't in control. Not really. The era of unchallenged American hegemony is over, and the establishment still hasn't accepted that. They keep acting as if the world is still 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and the US stood alone as the sole superpower. But it's not 1991 anymore. It's 2024, and the world is multipolar. Russia is resurgent. China is rising. And the global south, countries like Venezuela, Iran, and even traditional U.S. partners like India and Brazil are increasingly willing to defy Washington when it suits their interests. Let me give you an example. In 2022, when the U.S. tried to get the entire world to sanction Russia over Ukraine, it failed. Not completely, of course, Europe and Japan followed along. But China didn't. India didn't. Saudi Arabia didn't. And Venezuela? It doubled down on its relationship with Moscow, even hosting Russian military aircraft for joint exercises. That's not because these countries love Putin, it's because they see the US as a declining power, one that's more interested in lecturing them than in understanding their interests. And that brings me to the real: what is the US actually trying to achieve in Venezuela? Is it regime change? If so, it's failed for over a decade. Is it containment? If so, it's not working. Venezuela is still exporting oil to China, still hosting Russian military advisors, still deepening ties with Iran. Is it punishment? If so, then the US is succeeding, but at what cost? Every time the US tightens the screws, it pushes Venezuela further into the arms of its adversaries. Here's what the establishment won't tell: the US doesn't have a Venezuela policy. It has a Venezuela reflex, a knee-jerk reaction to any perceived challenge to its dominance in the hemisphere. And that reflex is making things worse. Now, let's out even further. Because Venezuela isn't just a problem for the US, it's a symptom of a much larger shift in global power. The US is still the world's strongest military power, but military power alone isn't enough to shape the world in the 21st century. What matters now is economic influence, technological dominance, and most importantly, diplomatic credibility. And on all three counts, the US is losing ground. China, for instance, doesn't need to invade Venezuela to gain influence. It just needs to offer what the US won't: investment, trade, and a non-judgmental partnership. That's why China is now Venezuela's largest creditor, why it's building infrastructure in the country, and why it's buying Venezuelan oil despite US sanctions. And Russia? It doesn't need to station troops in Caracas to be a player. It just needs to sell weapons, offer political support, and remind the world that there's an alternative to US dominance. The US, meanwhile, is stuck in a 20th century mindset. It still thinks it can bomb, sanction, or threaten its way to compliance. But the world has changed. The countries that once had no choice but to follow Washington's lead now have options. And the more the US tries to force them into line, the more they'll seek out those alternatives. So where does that leave us? If the US keeps doing what it's been doing, Venezuela will remain a crisis, a slow-burning conflict that drains resources, damages credibility, and strengthens America's rivals. But if the US changes course, if it accepts that it can't control every country, that sanctions often backfire, and that military threats are a last resort, not a first option, then maybe, just maybe, it can find a way forward. The problem is, the foreign policy establishment doesn't want to change course. Because change would mean admitting failure. And in Washington, failure is the one thing you can never admit. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the way Washington sees itself in the world. The foreign policy establishment has spent decades operating under the assumption that the US is the indispensable nation, the one that sets the rules, enforces them, and punishes those who break them. But here's the uncomfortable: that assumption is crumbling, and Venezuela is one of the places where the cracks are most visible. Let me explain why this matters for domestic politics. The US approach to Venezuela isn't just a foreign policy issue, it's a deeply partisan one, and it's become a proxy battle for something much the soul of American power. On one side, you have the hawks, the ones who still believe in the unipolar moment, who see every challenge as a test of American resolve. They're the ones pushing for more sanctions, more pressure, more threats of military action. They're the ones who, in 2019, recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president before he had any real power, betting that Maduro's regime would collapse under the weight of US pressure. That didn't happen. Instead, Maduro dug in, the economy didn't implode as predicted, and the US found itself in the awkward position of backing a leader with no real authority while the actual government in Caracas laughed all the way to the bank with Chinese and Russian support. On the other side, you have the realists, though they're a much smaller group in Washington these days, who argue that the US needs to accept that it can't control every country, that sanctions often hurt the wrong people, and that diplomacy, messy as it is the only way forward. They're the ones pointing out that the US has been trying to oust Maduro for years, and all it's gotten is a more entrenched regime, a more desperate population, and a stronger foothold for America's rivals. But here's the in Washington, being a realist is often seen as being weak. And in a town where strength is measured by how loudly you can rattle a saber, that's a dangerous label to wear. So where does that leave us domestically? It leaves us with a foreign policy that's stuck in a feedback loop. The hawks keep pushing for more pressure because they believe that's the only way to demonstrate American strength. The realists keep getting drowned out because admitting that the current approach isn't working would mean admitting that the hawks were wrong. And the American public? They're mostly disengaged until something like the submarine incident happens, and suddenly everyone's asking, why are we even involved in Venezuela? Let me give you a concrete example of how this plays out. In 2020, the Trump administration indicted Nicolas Maduro and several of his top officials on drug trafficking charges, offering a $15 million bounty for his capture. The move was meant to isolate Maduro, to signal to the world that the US wouldn't tolerate his regime. But what actually happened? Maduro didn't step down. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he used the indictments as proof that the US was out to get him, rallying his base and solidifying his control. The drug trafficking charges? They're still in place, but Maduro's still in power, and the US is still trying to figure out what to do. Now, fast forward to today. The Biden administration has walked back some of the Trump-era policies, easing a few sanctions here, engaging in quiet diplomacy there, but it hasn't fundamentally changed the approach. Why? Because changing the approach would mean admitting that the last 2 decades of Venezuela policy have been a failure. And in Washington, that's a non-starter. So instead, we get incremental shifts, half measures, and a lot of rhetoric about standing with the Venezuelan people while doing little to actually help them. Here's the US doesn't have to like Maduro. It doesn't have to approve of his government. But it does have to accept that he's not going anywhere anytime soon. And if it wants to have any influence in Venezuela, it needs to start thinking about how to engage with the country as it is, not as Washington wishes it to be. That doesn't mean lifting all sanctions tomorrow or recognizing Maduro as a legitimate leader. But it does mean acknowledging that the current approach isn't working and that continuing down the same path will only lead to more of the Venezuela that's poorer, more isolated, and more dependent on China and Russia. So what's the alternative? It starts with recognizing that Venezuela is a sovereign country, not a US colony. It means engaging with the opposition, yes, but also with the government, because that's the only way to push for real change. It means using sanctions more strategically, targeting the regime's elites, not the population, and coupling them with real diplomatic efforts to negotiate a way forward. And it means accepting that the US can't dictate the outcome in Venezuela. It can influence it, sure, but it can't control it. But here's the none of this is likely to happen, at least not anytime soon. Because in Washington, admitting that the US can't control every country is seen as a sign of weakness. And in a town where strength is everything, that's a risk no one wants to take. So instead, we'll keep seeing the same: more pressure, more sanctions, more threats, and more of the same results. And Venezuela? It'll keep being a pawn in a much larger game, one where the US is still trying to figure out how to play by the rules of the 21st century. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the broader collapse of US grand strategy in Latin America. For decades, Washington operated under the assumption that it could shape the region through a mix of economic pressure, covert action, and the occasional invasion. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't just a 19th century relic, it was a living, breathing framework for how the US saw its role in the hemisphere. But here's the uncomfortable: that framework is broken. The world has changed, and Washington hasn't kept up. Take the last major US intervention in the region, Haiti, in 2004. The US backed the ouster of Jean-Bertrand Aristide, a democratically elected leader, under the guise of restoring stability. What followed? A decade of chaos, a UN peacekeeping mission that became a vector for cholera, and a country that's now effectively a failed state. The lesson should have been: regime change doesn't work when you don't have a plan for what comes after. But instead of learning from that failure, the US doubled down in Venezuela, assuming that if it just applied enough pressure, Maduro would crack. Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela's borders. The US has spent the last 20 years trying to isolate Venezuela diplomatically, economically, and militarily. And yet, here we are in 2024, and Maduro is still in power. Russia is drilling for oil in Venezuela's Orinoco Belt, China is building infrastructure in exchange for future crude shipments, and Iran is using Venezuelan ports to evade sanctions. The US has effectively pushed Venezuela into the arms of its geopolitical rivals, not because Maduro loves Putin or Xi Jinping, but because he had no other choice. That's not strength, that's strategic malpractice. Here's another data point that should worry anyone paying. In 2023, Venezuela's oil exports to China hit their highest level in a decade, despite US sanctions. How? Because China doesn't care about human rights or democracy. It cares about securing energy supplies, and it's willing to work with anyone who can provide them. Meanwhile, the US is still clinging to the idea that if it just tightens the screws a little more, the Venezuelan people will rise up and overthrow Maduro. That's not strategy, that's wishful thinking. So what should the US do instead? Let's start with the accept that Venezuela is not a US problem to solve. It's a sovereign country with its own agency, and no amount of sanctions or covert ops is going to change that. The goal shouldn't be to replace Maduro with a US-friendly leader, it should be to create conditions where Venezuela can stabilize itself, with or without him. That means engaging with the government on issues where cooperation is possible, like counter-narcotics or energy security, while maintaining pressure on human rights abuses. Take the 2023 Barbados Agreement, for example. The US brokered a deal with Maduro to allow limited sanctions relief in exchange for free and fair elections. It was a rare moment of pragmatism, and it almost worked until the US pulled the rug out from under it by reimposing sanctions after Maduro's government arrested opposition figures. Now, the opposition is fractured, the deal is dead, and Venezuela is back to square one. That's not diplomacy, that's whiplash. Here's the US doesn't have to recognize Maduro as a legitimate leader to talk to him. It doesn't have to lift all sanctions to create space for negotiations. But it does have to stop treating Venezuela like a chess piece in a Cold War game. The alternative is what we have now, a country that's increasingly dependent on Russia and China, a population that's suffering under sanctions, and a US policy that's stuck in the past. Now, I can already hear the "but Maduro is a dictator. We can't reward him." And that's true. But here's the thing about dictators, they don't care about moral condemnations. They care about power, and they'll do whatever it takes to hold on to it. The US can either continue to isolate Venezuela and watch it become a client state of Beijing and Moscow, or it can try to shape the country's trajectory through engagement. That doesn't mean giving Maduro a free pass. It means using leverage where it actually works. Let's look at another Iran. The US spent decades trying to isolate Iran, only to realize that the only way to curb its nuclear program was through diplomacy. The 2015 nuclear deal wasn't perfect, but it was a hell of a lot better than the alternative, an Iran with a nuclear weapon. The same logic applies to Venezuela. The US doesn't have to love Maduro to talk to him. It just has to be willing to accept that sometimes, the enemy of your enemy isn't your friend, it's just another player in a much bigger game. So where does that leave us? With a choice. The US can keep pretending that it can dictate outcomes in Venezuela, or it can start playing the long game. That means accepting that change in Venezuela won't come overnight, and it certainly won't come through US fiat. It means working with regional partners like Brazil and Colombia, who have far more influence in Caracas than Washington does. And it means recognizing that the best way to counter China and Russia in Latin America isn't through sanctions and threats, but by offering the region a better alternative, one that's based on mutual respect, not coercion. But here's the: none of this will happen until Washington stops seeing Latin America as its backyard. The region isn't a collection of client states, it's a group of sovereign nations with their own interests, their own histories, and their own agency. The US can either adapt to that reality, or it can keep clinging to a 20th century playbook that's long past its expiration date. And that, in the end, is the real tragedy of Venezuela. It's not just that the US has failed to shape the country's trajectory, it's that it's failed to learn from its own mistakes. Every time Washington doubles down on a failed policy, it loses a little more credibility. Every time it ignores the lessons of history, it repeats them. And every time it treats a country like Venezuela as a problem to be solved rather than a partner to be engaged with, it pushes that country further away. So here's my final: Venezuela isn't the problem. The problem is the belief that the US can control the world. That belief has led to one disaster after another, from Iraq to Libya to Venezuela. And until Washington lets go of it, we're going to keep seeing the same results: more instability, more suffering, and more opportunities for America's rivals to step in. The question isn't whether the US can afford to change its approach to Venezuela. The question is whether it can afford not to,